Psalm 133. How good and pleasant it is when brothers live together in unity. It is like precious oil poured on the head, running down on the beard, running down on Aaron's beard, down upon the collar of his robes. It is as if the dew of Hermon were falling on Mount Zion, for there the Lord bestows his blessing, even life for evermore. Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. It says this: 14 years later, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus along also. I went in response to a revelation and set before them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. But I did this privately to those who seemed to be leaders, for fear that I was running or had run my race in vain. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. This matter arose because some false brothers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on the freedom that we have in Christ Jesus and to make us slaves. We did not give in to them for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might remain with you. As for those who seemed to be important, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not judge by external appearance. These men added nothing to my message. On the contrary, they saw that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, just as Peter had been to the Jews. For God, who was at work in the ministry of Peter as an apostle to the Jews, was also at work in my ministry as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Peter and John, those reputed to be pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognised the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the Jews. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. Set within the Lake District, just east of one of the highest mountains in England, Helvellyn, is a pathway called Striding Edge. Due to its height and also just how narrow it is, it's one of the most treacherous walks you might ever set out to do. You look down past 1 foot to a valley 1,000 feet below, and there is a similar drop from looking down the other side of you. It's a kind of a 1 foot wrong, whoops, you've gone kind of a path. It's full of twists and inclines that keep it perched on top of the ridge. So you need a really cool head and nerves of steel to be able to walk it. And I think, really, it's the kind of path that we find Paul on as we join him in this second chapter of Galatians, the path that is taken to reach gospel unity. This meeting that Paul recounts here is one that has great consequences for the future of Christianity, because true church unity is at stake here. Had all of those apostles in Jerusalem sided with or even tolerated some of the false teaching that Paul was speaking out against, then the church would have split. Paul's Gentile churches would have doubted the Jewish church's faith in Jesus Christ, and the Jewish churches would have also doubted the true salvation of those within the Gentile church. The questions and the doubts about the validity of each other's faith would have just gone on and on forever. So Paul is really right to have some fears over this meeting. He speaks in verse 2 about a fear that he's run his race in vain, that his ministry might be completely fruitless. It would seem that Paul doesn't fear so much that the Jerusalem apostles don't have the true gospel. What he does fear is that they might not be true to it. So as Paul walks this striding edge path to maintain gospel unity, the fall on one side of him comes if he overstresses that Peter and James and John approve of the gospel that he's preaching, because then others can point the finger at him and say, well, this just proves that Paul got this gospel not straight from Jesus Christ, but from these Jerusalem apostles, and he's just muddled it in his head along the way. But the fall the other side of him comes if he overstresses that God doesn't really care who's who in the church, that everybody is equal, and that the Jerusalem apostles are no more important to Christ than any other follower of Jesus. Because then, of course, he runs the risk of breaking fellowship with the church at the very centre of Christianity in Jerusalem. But from the outcome, it does seem as though Paul negotiates this path this ridge successfully. In verse 6, Paul says that the apostles add nothing to his message. They accept him, and their acceptance of Titus, who Paul took along with him, spoke clearly of the fact that they saw faith in Jesus Christ alone as being necessary for salvation. Titus, you see, was Greek, and therefore he wouldn't have been circumcised. Let's be honest, the church doesn't really have a great track record when it comes to unity, does it? We are far too often focused on the things that we differ on in our thinking and in our practice than the things that unite us. And in a world in lockdown, in a time when we are becoming more and more aware of the growing need for the church, the people have got to wake up and together to start making a difference within the communities that they serve. What might we learn from gospel unity as we see it in this passage? What are the markers of it that might help direct us today? Well, as it is, I see three of them. The first one that I see here is an acceptance of anyone and everyone who is in Christ Jesus. In verse 4, when Paul speaks about those who had infiltrated the ranks, he speaks about how they had done so to spy on the freedom they had in Christ Jesus. Being in Christ Jesus talks about those who've come to put their faith in the person of Jesus Christ as the Son of God, and their whole trust in everything he has done and achieved for them. Christian unity, you see, takes no account of any cultural distinctives. So just as Titus wasn't compelled in any way to be circumcised before he was accepted and welcomed into the family of faith, then we too must be sure that we don't insist on additions to gospel belief. It happens so easily. You must believe and be baptised, but be baptised in a certain way. You must believe, but you really mustn't drink any alcohol. You must believe, but you should dress in this appropriate kind of fashion. You should believe, but yes, it would be great if you could speak in tongues. There are so many ways in which the church will say that we are saved by faith alone, but we may also need some of their distinctives, those that mark a tradition or a denomination, distinctives that make you identical to everyone else within that group. Steve Taylor wrote a song some time ago now that was titled, "I Want to Be a Clone." It picks up on this theme with this lyric that says, "'Cause if you want to be one of his, you've got to act like one of us. Everybody must get cloned." And of course this is not how gospel unity works. It's not how it comes about, and it doesn't really reflect the true nature of God who created this whole world that's full of diversity. So who are the people that you struggle with simply because they're not like you? And it's really hard to accept at times that they are just as welcome, that they are just as committed to following Jesus, and that they are just as important within the church family as you are. The first of the markers of gospel unity, an acceptance of anyone and everyone who is in Christ Jesus. The second, I think, is a recognition of different callings. This is just what we see in those Jerusalem apostles in verse 7. "They saw," said Paul, "that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, just as Peter had been charged with preaching the gospel to the Jews." Peter and Paul preaching the same gospel, but recognising that there are different ways of going about preaching that gospel. Now this seems so incredibly straightforward and simple, doesn't it? And yet far too often within church settings, conflict often arises when someone comes along and does something differently. Why? Because the church seems to me to be full of people who know just how it's always been done. And when it isn't done that way, then the conclusion is it's probably not being done well, or certainly not done properly. But we need to grasp the fact that God has made each one of us unique. We are all different. We are capable of different things because we have different gifts and we have different callings. So who do you need to allow some freedom to today? To do things in a different way to how you are used to them being done. In a different way than you might like them to be done. The markers of this gospel unity, an acceptance of everyone and anyone who is in Christ Jesus. And also an acceptance of people's different callings and giftings. And lastly, I think a marker also is a care for the poor. I don't know whether you've noticed, but God does seem to have a great bias towards the poor and the needy. Right the way through the Bible, there is a call for God's people to care for those who are classed as the have-nots in society. Peter and Paul may have had very different mission fields, but we see in verse 10 that they are both held to this call to look after the poor. The Jerusalem apostles, they want to hold on to this, and of course in Paul they meet a willing volunteer who's eager to do this anyway. But the implications here also mean that these two very different churches, one set in Jerusalem and the other those that Paul are planting in Gentile areas, that these two different churches should stay interconnected. They should share resources with each other, because the fact was that the Jerusalem churches were much poorer than the ones that Paul was planting in Gentile areas. Now this is always going to seem a challenge to us, I think, because the truth is anything that might seem to threaten our authority and power to do with our money what we want is always going to be a challenge. What would it mean for us to share our resources generously, freely, willingly and openly? And what would that mean for you? These three things, an acceptance of all who are in Christ, a recognition of different callings and giftings, and a care for the poor, are all markers of gospel unity that can be seen in this passage. And these are some of the things that Paul has to negotiate as he sets out on his very own striding edge path towards unity. The thing is, he didn't do this all alone, and neither do we. The very reason that Paul keeps his balance, I think, is the vital ongoing work of God. In verse 8 we read, "For God, who was at work in and through the ministry of Peter, was also at work in my ministry." They knew, said Paul, that the grace had been given to me. I wonder just how differently our church communities and our whole communities might be if we as leaders and as members could be humble enough to recognise the gracious work of the one and only God in and through those who are not like us, in and through those who work very differently to us, in and through those who have a lot less than us. I have this feeling that gospel unity would then not just be some pipe dream, a distant hope, but it would become more a lived reality that would make the gospel, the power of God all about Jesus for everyone, known, no matter how steep the climb might seem to be.